Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Nelson. I'm the Senior Director for the Center for International Media Assistance at the National Endowment for Democracy. I want to welcome you to this important conversation we're going to have this afternoon about as part of the Journalism in the Time of Crisis conference. This particular panel is going to be looking at donor responses to supporting independent media during this crisis that we are going through. The crisis that we're talking about is not only the COVID-19 crisis, which has created quite an important challenge to the media sector, but to the ongoing and I would say equally complex and difficult crisis that the media sectors across the world were already going through before this crisis hit. So we're going to be looking at both of those things, at the immediate situation caused by COVID-19 and some of the really difficult things that the media sector is facing across the world. And we're going to be looking at the post-crisis environment and what we can do to use this moment of time as perhaps a launching point into new strategies for working together to deal with the ongoing problems that we know exist in the media sector. I wanted to start just by throwing a question out there about why are we talking about donors in the media sector? Why do we even care about this? As many of you know, international bilateral donors contribute about $150 billion a year for international development. And private philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation, Luminate, the Ford Foundation, the German Stiftungen, they contribute another really significant amount of money to helping developing countries deal with the problems and manage reforms and combat poverty and deal with health and education issues. And increasingly, media is seen as one of the key elements that need to be supported in countries that are going through a developmental process. And it has become a really recognized area for donor action. Donors often are really critical, not only to helping media find a pathway toward reform and change, but also just day-to-day survival, because in this environment that we're living in right now, donor funding is a critical part of this equation about independent media and how independent media can survive in the developing world. As I said earlier, the media was in a real crisis before the COVID-19 pandemic struck. And this has exacerbated a series of things that were going on in the media that are really difficult for journalists and independent voices across the world to manage. Countries were losing support from their populations and from their governments for independent media. And the political crisis that the media faces is in some countries really quite serious. Trust in the media has declined, and people don't necessarily think of the media as a really critical part of their environment. The media is also, another thing is media capture, the second important issue. Media capture is when a government or a wealthy businessman, and this is business person, and this is by far the most important part of media capture, wealthy oligarchs and business people buying media to influence public opinion. That is the dominant ownership model of media in many countries across the world. And that is a growing way that the media is being structured through that kind of captured ownership structure. And the third major issue is the business model itself. As many of you know, the news media has lost its most important link to a revenue source in advertising, because advertising has been largely captured by the online platforms like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. So the major revenue source that was really critical to creating independent media for many, many years is now not a dependable revenue source. So those three elements of crisis are really something that were exacerbated when the COVID-19 crisis hit. And we are finding out through surveys and through conversations with journalists and media organizations around the world that this crisis has become an existential crisis. While there's growing demand for high quality information during this crisis, and people are turning to high quality news and information, the ability of news organizations to produce that quality information is really undermined by the fact that their revenue streams have really collapsed. And there's growing attacks on journalists and censorship and pressure campaigns by governments against journalists. And this has created a real challenge for these organizations to do their work. So in the course of this conversation today, we're going to be talking about two themes: this crisis now and what we do about it in the future. And we're going to go around with a group of really important speakers and thinkers on this topic. And we're really extremely lucky to have not only a fantastic panel, but some really good people in the audience who can contribute to this conversation. So I'm really looking forward to going through this conversation with you. I'm going to introduce our panelists as we go. So I'm going to start by getting a point of view from the ground in a country that has really been critical to setting the agenda for independent media in Africa. Our first speaker is Joy Chelagat, who is the media business advisor at Internews based in Nairobi, Kenya. And she has been working in this crisis situation in Nairobi, writing about what's going on in the media sector. And we're going to turn to her to tell us a little bit about what's going on right now and how people are dealing with it. So Joy, if you could just start your conversation by introducing the challenge that we're facing in this moment of time.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Okay, great. Yes. So my name is Joy Chelagat. I'm a journalist based in Nairobi. Used to work with a media house before the COVID crisis hit, and in the middle of that, started working with Internews. So what's been quite interesting about the Kenyan situation, I think you adequately introduced it, was that the first thing that happened is from last year in Kenya, we started seeing a mass firing of journalists. We saw, one media house after the other announcing firing of journalists, and this started last year. And there was a great cry last year from media houses, and we're talking about from national level media houses, the ones that carry most of the advertising, all the way down to community-based stations. So there was a crisis situation already from last year. Come COVID crisis this year, the second thing that happened was there was a second wave of mass firings. The Media Council, as of April, said up to 600 employees of media houses, this is journalists, support staff, were fired or they had to take pay cuts. The organization I worked at woke up and decided to announce a 50% pay cut. And even the manner in which this was being rolled out heavily affected journalists because like in some organizations, people would just receive an email telling you that from this day, this is what you have to sign this document, and there's no out clause as a journalist. And if you're not going to take it, oh well. So while that was happening, at the same time, you were finding that newsroom leaders still had to find a way to get the news out there. So like in the case of where I was working, we had to find out who has laptops, who doesn't have. And what this is very interesting, and particularly in the Kenyan and African contexts, you'll find that oftentimes laptops and machines are not there for everyone. So they're often office sharing. So even when government restrictions came in, it was quite a crisis situation for media houses on ground in Kenya, even in terms of seating arrangements, in terms of even ventilation. Some of those things were actually practically very difficult in terms of trying to rearrange around the COVID crisis. So what we saw after that is the journalists and their unions went to court, and there were back and forth court battles. We saw some very key media houses in Kenya not honoring what the court said. Standard Group went to the Standard Group journalists and KUJ. They went and they said, this is not right. You cannot wake up. You have to follow a certain procedure if you're going to affect people's pay. And still, despite the court saying that you guys need to find a way to discuss and agree with your staff, the pay cuts continued. So there was an aspect of even the rule of law not being honored when journalist unions. So even when unions, when you have strong unions, sometimes you can go to court and the laws are not enforced. But as time went on, when the whole media sector realized what was happening is the ad market crashed, we started seeing collections and stakeholder engagements where we found editors guilds, the media council all came together and started having conversations about what needs to be done. Prior to the COVID crisis hitting, let me just get some numbers here. Prior to the COVID crisis hitting Kenya, the government, which still takes about 60% of the advertising, brings about 60% of the advertising in Kenya, owed the media 2.8 billion Kenya shillings. In USD, that is 2.8 million. And so while the government is saying that we want to support you guys as essential workers, the other thing that we were seeing was the government had not been honoring their business obligations to the media, hence therefore contributing to media sustainability challenges in the country. On the other side, what we also saw was some of the lobby groups were saying that the government is unwilling to pay because by not paying, the media is then beholden to the government and state organizations. So where is the state at now? What we're seeing right now is media organizations are still trying to find a hybrid of working from home. They're trying to push, the Standard Group and other organizations are trying to innovate around reader revenue and trying to promote different types of business models and even doing virtual events. They're trying to innovate around that. But the situation is still dire as it is because the advertising is still not coming in. The media houses are still wondering if there's going to be a second wave of pay cuts and a second wave of redundancies. So that's the situation in Kenya.
You get the impression that there is increased demand for the quality journalism that is being produced? Do you feel that the people are turning to
yes.
quality media?
So that was one of the key things. One of the areas where the media did win in Kenya is the media actually really pushed the government to lock down flights. While the COVID crisis was happening across the world, Kenya was still having flights coming back and forth. And it took the media actually having an active campaign. And we saw lots of even editorial pieces pushing the government. The Standard Group had a very beautiful paper, and they actually said, these are the people who are traitors of our country. They're selling the country. And from there, we now saw legal action. And the government actually started locking down the Kenya Airways and the rest. So that was a major win for the media. What we also saw with the ratings of different stations is particularly radio stations in Kenya saw quite a rise, particularly those ones who were dealing with COVID programming. When we went down to looking at the geopol numbers, what was very interesting is we had a national broadcast at 3 p.m. and we saw lots of people tuning into media, and there was a very significant rise in the ratings for media stations. We saw also quite a significant rise in SMS, because in Kenya, a lot of people would SMS in questions, or they would criticize what the government is doing or what they think should be done. We also saw a lot of people taking the initiative of reporting what is happening on ground. So one of the things that happened was, yes, there was an increase in the interest in media. And what was happening is when people would see things on social media, they would quickly run to media accounts to go and verify and say, is this actually true? Where did this come from? Because there's a lot of disinformation. So one of the things that we did see was there was an increase in consumption of media, and even the initial traffic on the websites. Where I was working, I think we saw about a 20% increase in our website traffic. And the website traffic really coincided with when we were doing the live streams from the government addresses, or when the government was expected to make specific announcements. So yes, the media did win in that, but I think in Kenya, what really did shift the bar for the media was the fact that they were very keen on putting the pressure on the government to actually put in place restrictions to protect the country.
That's great. Well, I think it's similar in many parts of the world, the same kind of peril and coming from the crisis, and opportunity coming from this increase in engagement with audiences and the possibilities. Sticking with Internews, I want to turn to Marjorie Rouse, who is Senior Vice President for Programs at Internews and is looking at this issue from the global perspective. And I just wonder what your findings about this crisis are right now from that global perspective, Marjorie.
Yes.
What are you seeing?
I mean, as Joy described, the situation in Kenya is a really good microcosm for what we're seeing in other markets. You know, most of the media we work with, and we have a team in Internews known as Newsgain that is really focused in just on this specific issue. And we've increased our investment in this as an organization because I think there's been an assumption in the health community and other communities and those that do behavior change communications that these media partners will always just exist. They're going to be there, and then you can drop your ad revenue in them or your PSAs, but they're facing an existential crisis in COVID. So we've been working with a lot of our partners. So we had this contradiction. We saw partners getting 2 to 3 times the level of traffic in the first wave of pandemic. Those, especially those local trusted news sources, were getting a lot of traffic. At the same time, their advertising was shrinking. I think Joy mentioned a really important fact, and that is that for many local media, the #1 advertiser is the government. And the government advertising, if they stop paying their bills, you've taken a huge chunk of revenue off the table. We also saw that advertisers were reluctant to advertise next to COVID content, especially early on, which also pushes away revenue. So you had this juxtaposition of 2 to 3 times the eyeballs. And you know, most of our outlets saw about 80% drop in revenues, and they still haven't recovered. They're globally, I'd say, you know, talking to our Newsgain colleagues, that they're still down about 45% pre-COVID. You know, since this panel is focused on donors, the media that had some level of donor support in general are weathering this better because they have at least a percentage of their revenue that's not completely vulnerable. And also we have, you know, for some media that have been reluctant to go digital or to adapt digital strategies or to look at programmatic, you know, different ways of generating revenue, this has been a do or die moment. So we actually see media that have been hesitant to adapt becoming adapters, because if they don't become adapters at this point, you know, where they're not going to necessarily survive. So, you know, it's a really tough environment, and you can't make any assumptions. I think for the larger development community, those assumptions that it would always be there are broken. And these are, you know, these local media, especially the local trusted media and communities, are just really important players in a crisis. And, you know, they need that sustained ongoing support.
And one of the interesting things that we're finding in this crisis is that it's actually a niche of the media. It's not the entire media sector that the international community really is trying to help, because as I mentioned in my introduction, a lot of the media is captured by unsavory forces. And what we're left with is the independent part of the media that actually can receive funding and use it very effectively from donors. So I want to turn to Mira Milosevic, who is based in Europe and who is working as the executive director of the Global Forum for Media Development. This is a coalition of media development organizations, and Mira has been part of an ongoing conversation between the organizations that need media development funding and those funders that do that kind of funding. And you've been tracking this crisis and thinking about it from your perspective. What are you seeing in Europe in this field?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Yes, what Joy and Marjorie have outlined is exactly what we are seeing in both what we call developing and emerging markets, and also in the most developed democracies around the world. And so on one hand, you have partners of groups like Internews that are working in communities. Those are local media, nonprofit media organizations. And those have been hit the most, both by initial advertising decline that we have seen over the last 15 years, but also by COVID crisis. And so those are the outlets that are suffering the most. So for instance, globally, all the digital and print news publishers will suffer between 25 and 30% in advertising revenue decline. But those on local level will suffer much more. So what Marjorie is saying, it's up to 80% in some cases. And we have already seen that in countries like Brazil, we, for instance, have 30% of population without a single source, local source of community news, which in COVID context is actually lack sometimes of life-saving information. And it's similar in Venezuela and other countries. And we have colleagues in Europe from OCCRP, for instance, Investigative Journalism Network, that say that thousands of stories in the region go uncovered. And on the other hand, from the donor perspective, you mentioned why would donor need to fund media development? Globally, we have agreed in 2015 at the UN level to work towards sustainable development goals. And all the donors are actually investing their development assistance towards these goals. And we have seen, and there is some really good research showing that, for instance, education, which is goal 14, equality, which is, I think, goal 10, and then climate change, goal 13, are all really highly correlated with access to information, impartial, truthful, and credible information. So we will not be able to reach these sustainable goals if we don't have journalists and media that report and cover these issues. And you know that applies also to COVID crisis. A lot of countries will have many more people die unless they have access to credible and timely information.
Yes, it's really a time when we need to draw these conclusions that we're seeing around us and learn from these things that we're learning during this crisis. I mean, I think we are learning a lot about how important the donor role is and about what are the most effective ways to do donorship in this field. And I'd like to turn to one of our donors now, maybe Simon Collard-Wexler. You are representing the Global Affairs Canada. You're Executive Director for Human Rights and Indigenous Affairs Policy. And Canada is a major donor in the international system and has been very supportive of the work that we've been doing in this field to raise this issue to the international level, to get bilateral donors to pay attention to this problem and to draw other actors into the process. So Simon, can you tell us a little bit about how you're seeing it from the Canadian perspective?
Sure, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here and have this discussion. I mean, I think from our point of view, it's tremendously important on a number of levels, as I'd like to explain. I mean, I'm coming at it from the point of view of a diplomat whose main role is to protect Canada's interests and to promote Canadian values. And for both of these, media development is essential. I mean, from something that's very key for Canada, as you might know, we have a feminist foreign policy and a feminist international assistance policy. And media development plays a key role for that because of access to information, freedom of expression, making societies more democratic and inclusive. These are all enablers for sustainable development. So for us, it's very, very, very clear that we need to have these, and they're all interlinked, right? We see democracy promotion, good governance is linked to sustainable development. But I would also like to say that, you know, beyond development and democracy and good governance, for us, it's also a question of conflict prevention and a lot of the work that we do there. We have very good organizations like the Fondation Hirondelle that works in this. We've seen the UN with the Okapi project in the Congo try to work on this to stabilize certain regions. And I would also argue that for us, media development, especially of an independent professional media, is also good to countering disinformation, which we see as a strategic threat both to our democracy, but also to stability globally. So you can tell that we're not looking at this from a narrow point of view. We see this as very, very broad. And generally speaking, it's true that media development is a relatively small percentage of overall, development assistance. Since in 2012 to 2018, Canada spent about $17 million on this. And now this is just ODA-able funding. Of course, it's connected to other funding that we have as well. But it is something that we've looked at quite a bit. And I think, we're also very aware that in addition to being something we want to develop as a good in its own right, that there are challenges, this extinction level threat that's facing the media. We're well aware of that. And we know that this is something we need to work on. Of course, in the current context, from our point of view, all our efforts connected to combating COVID, both domestically and internationally, depend on reliable media. The WHO has talked about the infodemic, the spread of misinformation, either deliberate disinformation or misinformation that people have. So for us, a public health response, both at home and abroad, depends on this. And so this is part of the reason why we're so keen on this. I would say also, just to build on what Mira was saying in terms of the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals. I mean, yes, it's connected specifically to SDG 16 target, 10, but it is connected to everything else in terms of how we do this. So for us, it's not a secondary development issue at all. It is actually something that's a pretty central pillar to what we're doing. And of course, in terms of democracy promotion, I mean, I work in government. I know what effect independent media has. When hard questions are asked from us, we have to answer. Our minister wants an answer to that. And they take that responsibility very seriously. So we can tell what kind of effect it has in terms of enhancing democracy. And then maybe just the last point I'd like to make in terms of, I work on human rights policy. And for us, obviously, media freedom is part of freedom of expression. This is a fundamental human right under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on Civil and Political Rights. But it's not just that, it's that a free independent media draws our attention to other violations that are occurring. We may have a whole network of diplomats and embassies and intelligence services, but let me tell you, 85% of the time that we hear about human rights violations or abuses occurring, it's because of independent journalism and civil society groups. And for us, that's an essential part of the infrastructure to good governance and human rights. So maybe just give that maybe an initial response to why we think it's so important.
Yeah, well, that is a really, really excellent overview of the many different aspects of why media matters and why donors should care about it. So thank you so much. It's almost something I'd like to capture and put on a video just in and of itself, because I think you made a really good overview of the argument. I'd like to ask Alex Yakana, who is who's a program officer from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who works on global media partnerships and has participated in a lot of the private philanthropy conversations that are going on in this field. How do you guys see it? How does the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation see this this sector, and what are you doing in this crisis period?
So thanks, Mark. Picking up from what Joy and Mira and Simon have so eloquently laid out, it's the media effects theory, is decades old now. There's a robust body of study and literature that shows that media matters. And when it comes to the Gates Foundation in particular, the foundation exists primarily to address global health and development issues that by far disproportionately affect the world's poorest people. I mean, we're talking about 75% of the world's population living in low to middle income countries. And I think COVID has illustrated very well how interconnected we all are and how it is unwise to try and silo segments of our lives. Health and development will directly impinge on your economics. It will impinge on your democracy. It will impinge on your politics, peace and security. All of these things are interwoven. And yet one thing that came very quickly to light as the foundation was addressing these issues was that these are underreported issues and they're often ignored. And it's because newsrooms were facing the pressures that Joy and Mira and Simon and Marjorie have talked about as business models are collapsing, business owners are not going to be quite inclined to dedicate very scarce resources to enteric and diarrheal diseases, because let's face it, is Coca-Cola going to want to advertise next to that, or to neglected tropical diseases, or routine immunization, or R&D when it comes to vaccines and trying to get pandemic preparedness in place? No. So this is where the foundation felt that stepping in and helping newsrooms that were already in a posture to do more when it comes to raising knowledge and awareness around global health and development issues, but had these barriers, could be supported, help them to put in place the editorial teams that need to be in place to be able to generate the content. And the three guiding principles here are basically the editorial and creative independence is sacrosanct, and that is ring-fenced right from the beginning. The choice of media partners is to your point, Mark, about ownership structures, would not work, say, with state-owned media. Would look for independent media leaders in their sector and try and keep that going as well. And then transparency, for the media grantees to be transparent about the relationship with the foundation. And for the foundation, of course, it puts all the grants that we make out publicly to be addressed. So this is where we've sort of been making those investments in building those newsrooms. Within the context of COVID in particular, one of the things, the many things that COVID has sort of thrown up is that, one, evidence-based information is important in the best of times, but during this time, it has just become absolutely critical. And yet, the access to data quite often requires a set of skills and sometimes headcount that newsrooms may not have, and as well as hardware in places and in newsrooms that even in the best of times, media owners didn't see a business case for. So one of the things that the foundation is looking to do is to focus on how we can support in data journalism that actually helps not only help get people the information they need to understand what's happening and make the right choices, but also to build their resilience against misinformation and to be able to reduce the effect of misinformation once it has made its way into their news feeds. And then the other thing is about solutions. When people for weeks and months, it's now coming on to a year, have been fed an information stream that their lives have been reduced to color-coded maps and death tolls and death rates, and it can be exhausting. It can push people into a state of despondency. It creates a fertile environment for polarization and all these other things we know. So highlighting where people are doing things that are working, whether it's Nigeria CDC's preparation plans or Ghana's increase in emergency funding, this solutions-oriented storytelling helps pull people and spare them the ditch of despondency. And then, of course, gender equality, and Simon mentioned about that. And there's a great report that came out from, you can find it on the International Women Media's Forum, about the underrepresentation of women's perspectives in COVID news. These are some of the things that the foundation is looking at. Mark, over.
Thank you, Alex. That's great. It's a good segue to our next speaker, who is James Dean, who has been working from his perch at BBC Media Action for many years on this problem that we're talking about here today, and who is now helping to think through some of the solutions that we need to think about in terms of how to organize the donor community around this challenge that we're talking about. So James, I'd like to turn to you to make this segue from the current crisis into the longer term solutions. And we'll then have another round with all our speakers to talk about some of these longer term challenges and bring in people from the audience. In the meantime, if you have a question for any one of the speakers, please use our chat feature or the Q&A feature to ask your question, and we will try to get to you and even open up for some questions later after our second round. So James, I'll turn to you at this point.
Thanks very much, Mark. So I'm head of policy at BBC Media Action, which is the BBC's independent media support charity. But I've also, working with Mark, with Mira, with others, been engaging with the OECD and the Development Assistance Committee there to try and improve both the prioritization of media support by the international development community and the organization of that support. And that's been happening for a long time now, 10, 15 years of trying to boost the amount of money the development community allocates to media support. And I think we have to ask the question, why is that been so difficult? And I think the principal reason for that has been that it's not that people aren't convinced generally about the value of media to democracy, to development, even in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's much more to do with nervousness among many donors about what they see as effectively a market intervention, picking winners, getting involved in a highly political, highly complex area where they need a lot of skills to really work out what the heck they're doing, tracking what's working and what's not working. And really there's no systems very few systems within the development community, the official development community, and tiny numbers of people who exist to actually work out what an effective media support strategy looks like. And I think what's happening now are two things for that community which are really changing things. The first is that while they may be nervous about market intervention, that nervousness is rooted in a belief that there is a market. And the fact is that there isn't a market any longer. Particularly for low-income countries, the market is fundamentally broken. And independent media, however smart or agile or digitally savvy they are, fundamentally creating a sustainable business out of the provision of trustworthy information, particularly in low-income countries and particularly to large numbers of people, is simply become impossible for all the reasons other people have mentioned. So that's been one issue which I think has begun to hit home. And the second, of course, is COVID, and the fact that it's turbocharged the attention paid to this stuff affects millions and millions of people's lives. If you don't have this supply of trustworthy information at a time where people are demanding access to trustworthy information in handling a huge, unprecedented crisis, then the whole of development is in big trouble. So put aside all the arguments around the value of media in holding government to account, in corruption, in social cohesion and the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change and so on. This issue, I think, has really brought it home. So I think the donors are beginning to understand that this is different from what's happened in the past. And the other thing that's happening, which is different from what's happened in the past, is I think the media development community is realizing that something has fundamentally changed. Organizations like BBC Media Action were set up on a set of assumptions that actually if a regulatory environment and legislative environment could be got right, if a capacity building strategies could be put in place, if a business mentoring strategies could be put in place, the kind of content partnerships, the understanding of audiences, all the things that we do to support independent media, drawing on the BBC or drawing on our own capacities, but ultimately we would be working towards a editorially independent, financially sustainable, whatever the model was of media that could survive into the future. And I think it's very clear that it doesn't matter how well you do all those strategies, you're not going to be supporting, you're not going to be getting to that state of a editorially independent, financially sustainable media ecosystem. That's a mirage at the moment. And but the problem then becomes one of money. Organizations cannot sustain themselves without funding. And we heard that from a fantastic presentation this morning from Julie Pizzetti from a Journalism and a Pandemic project, where their big survey found that number one thing people are looking for is funding, and institutional funding which supports them as institutions into the future. And if a problem becomes one of money, then who decides who gets that money? And in deciding who gets that money, you're probably going to be deciding which media survive and which media fail. And that's really not something that organizations like BBC Media Action should be deciding. That's something which is a different role in terms of media support, at least in the longer term. So that really means that we've got three challenges. The first is how to scale up the amount of money available to a much larger extent than has been happening at present. The second is to ensure that support is coherent and strategic. And the third is to ensure that the support provided is legitimate and transparent, and the people receiving it are confident that there is a system behind it that they can trust. And these are all the reasons why we've been proposing, and this is increasingly led by Luminate, who I'm also a consultant to at the moment, 2 days a week, for an international fund for public interest media. And the international fund is designed to be a channel, a mechanism to allow donors to, particularly bilateral donors, but also potentially tech companies and other donors who are not currently supporting media at scale, to massively scale up their support to this area, to get out of this 0.3% of development assistance and get it to what Mark has suggested, which I think is great, it's a 1% of development assistance. And the idea of this is it has to be really big. It's not worth doing unless it's raising at least $100 million a year, and really it needs to be more like $1 billion a year. And that's the kind of figures that we're trying to work towards. So I can talk a lot more about the International Fund. We might come back to it in perhaps a little bit later, but just very quickly, the kind of principle around this is that the fund would be managed by, there would be a corporate board. And just like the Global Fund for AIDS, TB and Malaria, it is, donors don't get to say where the money goes. The people who get to say where the money goes are the people who are from a journalistic community, also from fund management community, people who are most expert in managing a fund like this and apportioning it where it needs to ensure a real legitimacy and effectiveness. So we've produced a 40,000 word feasibility study for this. I'll put it in a link, but it's luminategroup.com/IFPIM, International Fund for Public Interest Media. And we lay out the rationale for this, the structure, the governance, the evaluation, the resourcing strategy, and just about everything else hopefully you can think of. We've worked very closely with Mira at GFMD doing a consultation around it. And we've also worked with PwC to do a kind of analysis of other global funds and how to organize in that way. So I can talk a lot more about that, but I'll just flag that at the moment. Maybe we'll come back to it in the conversation.
That's great. That's a really good thing to have on the table, and the reasoning behind it. And I think it's really critically important initiative. One of the interesting things that we have been hearing from a lot of the NED supported, the National Endowment for Democracy, where SEMA is based, gives about 25% of its overall funding to independent media, and does so in a way that is often just direct support for business operations. You know, it's done in a pretty open sort of way, and it sometimes goes over long periods of time. And we, you know, our funding was really critical to the creation of some really well-known independent media organizations that are in the developing world, like Rappler in the Philippines, and Malaysia Kini in Malaysia. They were all funded initially by NED funding. And what we're hearing from a lot of those organizations is that they are pessimistic about the business model, but they do believe that a hybrid model of funding is actually a pretty healthy way to organize a media system, so that you get funding from different sources, not only from one funder, but from a variety of funders, and also from a variety of activities, selling subscriptions, doing things to make yourself more responsive to the market and listening to your audience. So we are hearing that, this may be more of a transition period that we're thinking about. So it may be possible that if we do this right and fund the media effectively for some years and with enough rigor and a higher level of support, we may be able to turn this crisis into something that would actually be more sustainable in the long run. So I think the Global Fund could play a role like that. And I want to turn back to Marjorie, because I know that a lot of Internews's grantees see this sort of hybrid approach as being critical to the way they're dealing with this crisis and to their future. So how do you see that? And what do we need to do to take this moment of crisis and turn it into something that's more sustainable?
Well, I think, as I discussed at the opening, a crisis is also a horrible thing to waste, and it is pushing organizations to test models that they were hesitant about in the past, to look at different advertising streams. And, we're very much in agreement with you that a healthy media organization is going to have a diverse set of revenue streams and not be 100% donor dependent in any single way. And this doesn't just apply to, this applies to media everywhere. This applies as much to media here where I'm sitting as it is to any place we work. So when the crisis happened, we did three things. We upped our investment in business models with NewsGain. Joy is sitting here because she joined Internews in the crisis. We saw a crisis in the Kenyan market and had been in conversations with Joy for a long time. And she is absolutely brilliant on these things. And her new job is to focus on Africa and all of our partners, starting with Kenya. We invested in a mentor bench that spans everything from different business models to health journalism. And I can talk a bit about their work. And then the third thing we did in March is we saw that a lot of these local, especially small organizations that were meeting highly niche market, like super local community media, were on the verge of extinction. So we partnered with Luminate, who James has referred to. And between money we were able to put to the table and Luminate came up with a $600,000 rapid response fund that rolled out in March. So March feels like a million years ago to me. I'm not sure if everybody else feels the same way. But we rolled it out and we tried to get as many local organizations as possible. We got over 1,000 applications and ended up with the 600,000. We got 1,000 applications in 100 countries. We moved all 600,000 in 189 grants. And this was also, it was pretty lightweight. These grants are all $3,000 to $4,000 is the average size, and lightweight in terms of what we were asking them to do, because we knew it was a crisis we needed to respond to quickly. But it was also a great opportunity to gather information about what local media is struggling with. And the vast majority of them needed the assistance for content, just they didn't have resources to produce needed COVID content. And then the next highest request was survival, followed by equipment. So in some cases, these little investments kept payroll going. They bought some needed equipment or allowed them to focus in. So our partners span everything from, small radio stations in Ukraine. We worked with a Brazilian partner that's a nonprofit media in one of the largest slums that literally needed to get information out to slum residents. We also supported a Filipino migrant community media in the UK, in Great Britain, because the Filipino population, Great Britain, had very high corona incidence, and we needed to get information out in their language that they could understand. So that gives you, a sort of snapshot on what we supported, but it was revealing into what the needs are and how even small investments in a crisis like that can bridge. But there is that bigger problem of sustainability, viability. I think we as funders need to work really closely with our partners. We need to push them now in this crisis to think differently about their models, to look at diversification, and to find ways to meet their audience needs. the mentor bench we're doing is another way to help them with being better at meeting the health journalism needs. That gets at disinformation as well, because if they're not prepared to cover health, most local media outlets we partner with are not, they don't have beat health reporters. They might not have that expertise, and yet they're working in their community in local languages. So shortly, I think our mentor bench will have out things like guidance on plasma therapy for journalists, vaccine information sheet. We see, we were looking at disinformation around vaccines before COVID hit. And now we're looking at a global vaccine effort in the age of disinformation. And it's something that like the media and the medical community, the health community need to tackle together, because the disinformation and misinformation around vaccines everywhere from Nigeria to Ukraine to Indonesia to Pakistan that were huge issues for the health community is just going to escalate. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's really good. Mira, do you want to jump in on this conversation at this point? One of the issues that comes to mind as we're discussing this now is we're talking very much about the media and its business models and the way that it exists in society. We haven't been talking very much about the broader enabling conditions for media and the media environment, and how do we come together to support the policy reform process that needs to take place in many parts of the world. I mean, we just saw transitions happen in recent years in Tunisia, in Ethiopia, one now in Sudan. There are countries that are coming with political reforms, and they come to the international community. I mean, I'm very familiar with the Ethiopia story because we had a NED grantee, a NED contact who went to the president's office, and he went around looking for funding to help create a policy reform process for the media sector during the transition in Ethiopia. But they only got one donor that was willing to pay for one consultant to sit in the president's office. And they didn't get the support they needed during that really short period of transition when they could have done so much. How do we make the case that this is a broad system of governance that we need to work on that requires sometimes serious policy reforms and, the same way we would deal with transforming the health sector or the education sector. We need to work on the media sector. What do you think about that, Mira?
Thank you for the question. And I think that James started talking about it when he said that, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we had all these assumptions that we made around media systems. And we also had this set of media laws, standards, and practices that have shaped and defined how journalism organizations and the media sector operates. And so on one hand, we have the fact that the business environment, technological environment, and social environment has changed so much that we don't have a secured space for journalism and news media to survive. On the other hand, we have this rapid growth of digital platforms, digital information spaces, that unlike heavily regulated media spaces, are actually at this point more like a Wild West in terms of how they're shaped and regulated. And so misinformation and disinformation, of course, thrives in this digital space, and there's so many factors that impact it. And I was speaking in a panel on Tuesday, and I compared it. I said YouTube only earns from advertising $15 billion US dollars per year. This is more than all newspapers, digital news media, and magazines in the world earn per year. And the trend for YouTube and other platforms is growing. and the trend for journalism organizations is going down. And so within this digital space, we need to figure out everywhere in the world, where is the space for public interest information? Where is the space for journalism? How are we going to do that? Because with the private and corporate governance so far, that hasn't been the case. So that is one huge area of policy where I think we need to have more power and more voices from the journalism and media community. At the moment, when we have debates, for instance, in Europe around the Digital Services Act, which is the major regulation of digital markets at the moment, we have very few organizations that have capacity to investigate these issues at depth and to really understand what are the mechanisms behind digital advertising, for instance, and how does that impact small digital news businesses, and how are they disadvantaged? Marjorie mentioned that advertisers were reluctant to advertise next to COVID content. There is a huge need to advocate and develop policy in the area that needs to prove to advertisers that there is absolutely no proof that advertising with credible news content has negative impact on brands. And at the moment, it's the other way around. They're addressing misinformation and disinformation by blacklisting legitimate journalism and news content. So that's another huge policy area where we have very low capacity to advocate as a sector. There are many more, like I mentioned, tax relief, designating journalism as a charitable status cause so that private donors and individual donors can invest more into journalism. We have developed as GFMD and together with 180 organizations around the world, an appeal for supporting journalism in the time of COVID. And we have, I think, 6 groups of stakeholders that we call to do everything they can to support journalism. And I will place that link into the chat.
Great, that's really helpful. And I want to jump over to Joy to have you react to what Mira just said. I mean, from the ground level in Kenya, and from your work in Africa, how do you see this broader environment intervention or engagement that needs to take place? Can outsiders help on that front? Can foreign donors support policy reforms and policy changes? Were they helpful in Kenya at any point? You need to unmute your microphone. And please start thinking of questions because we're going to jump to questions very soon. And please put them in the chat box or let us know that you want to speak. Joy.
Thank you. So I think when you look at what's happened in Kenya over the last number of years, we've consistently changed different types of business models. As we've said, we've rebranded. There's been so many different changes that businesses have made to try and increase their revenue. And what we're realizing is that some of those changes they're actually not having the impact. So what we're realizing is that if you get to the space where we're helping organizations diversify, let's give an example of one of the things that we've done with the DRC that's currently happening in DRC. So we have found great journalists who have started their own independent organizations. And right now, through donor funding, we're actually helping them to develop business models, to understand how to run it as a business. So I think when there is direct support, as we're saying, towards helping organizations, first of all, improve their structures. And because some of the stuff, I think it's also just improving some of the structures and the processes. I think also that would be quite important, but also a broader conversation around policy would be very important, particularly when you're looking at digital in Kenya. Kenya is a trendsetter, particularly in digital, but what you find very interestingly, as we've talked about, the duopoly also affects Kenya. I remember one time when I was working, this is during the elections 2017, allow me to just give an on-ground example. During 2017, we were running the elections, we were uploading up to about 50 videos a day. And this is at KTN. KTN is under Standard Group in Kenya. You're uploading up to 60 videos a day. You know, you're having concurrent viewers of sometimes when you're streaming up to 20,000. And for all that effort, and you have 8 people working, what you are getting is 1 million Kenya shillings equivalent of 10,000 USD. And that was the best that we had gotten. And that was during elections when you have global viewership. Usually every month we're talking about 3,000. Now, if I can bring it back to what it costs to run that team, you're talking about an investment of a number of laptops, you're talking about an editorial team, you're talking about 2 different shifts. And I know I'm getting into the weeds by looking at that, but it kind of helps you see what we're talking about, why there is a need. And if we are to come with a solution that helps us, number one, look at how are these global tech companies ensuring that they're giving funding to help independent media, but the real question is, wouldn't it make more sense to have a rev share from the beginning? And it's, if I can just give another very simple example, Facebook a couple of years ago in Kenya loaded quick, fast loading pages. And many media houses jumped to it because they're like, yes, you know, mobile data in Kenya, that's where people connect. So anything that allows our users to connect content faster, we'll do it. When we implemented it, we realized a 15-20% drop in our ad revenue, because then we weren't getting ads directly through that. So first of all, we have to push to get, you have to have a staff of 3 or 4 people to run your Facebook page. And then when your content is posted on Facebook, you don't even get the 20% or the 15% you could have gotten from the ads that were there. I think also another important conversation, sorry, just a final one to add about the advertising space. We also just need to have a big conversation about global advertisers and the advertising policy. What's happening right now in Kenya is a major advertisers like Coca-Cola, we're talking about telco companies, those are large advertisers in Kenya. When they're advertising right now, they're advertising through Google. Yet they have agencies in Kenya, and their agencies can actually work directly to put like a larger percentage of the funding directly to the media houses in terms of digital advertising. So I think some of the conversations can also go around that to kind of enable in spaces where you do have operations in country, that it really makes no sense to have to go through Google and Facebook, whereas there are actually ways that you could get that support directly. So I think also some of those things and I think that's why NewsGain, just to touch on what Marjorie was talking about, why they brought in the NewsGain team and the media business team, is to look at some of the smaller things that even as we're talking about expanding the model, when we're talking about a hybrid model, sometimes turning those little taps so that we can increase the amount of money that comes into media. So yes, thank you.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to ask Simon to jump in at this point because Canada and the UK have joined forces to try to give a jump start on a global scale to this issue of media freedom and international policy. I mean, governments have 2 big policy areas that they can use to support the media sector. One is from foreign and security policy, where foreign ministries put sanctions on countries that kill journalists, and they ostracize them when they don't behave. And then they have the development policy, which we've been talking about mostly today. And you're hosting the next piece of a conversation that started in London last year on this approach. And I just wonder if you could say a few words about what you're doing on that front of sort of as a global push for media freedom.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think you're absolutely right when we talk about the different ways foreign ministries look at this, because on the one hand, I mean, we see 2 big strands of action. One is support for media development. I think this is the stuff we're talking about today, which is critical. The second is defending media freedom. And these are really 2 sides of the same coin. Without media freedom, existing outlets, no matter how professional they are or how sustainable they are, they'll be silenced, right? Those voices won't be heard, and they won't be able to perform the critical tasks they serve. But without financial sustainability, the quality and quantity of journalism is going to decline. Certain media institutions will be a lot more vulnerable to pressures from governments and other regulators on these issues. And effectively, the free press won't be able to play its role. So, I really see these as both of the same point on that. And so just on the point of media sustainability, I mean, this is something we're going to look at during this conference. So just to be very clear, this is a conference, a second global conference for media freedom. We're co-hosting with Botswana, and it's going to take place on the 16th of November. It's a public event, so everyone is invited to participate. There'll be a news release on that next week for your information. It's focused on a healthy global information ecosystem during COVID-19, but it will cover issues also like media sustainability. We've had a good discussion with Mira on this, because when we talk about promoting media sustainability, in the past we've talked a lot about professionalization efforts for journalists or providing certain equipments and things like this. But I think what this discussion today has really highlighted is that is only the surface of it. We have deeper questions about the sustainability, the business model, the regulatory environment, like Mira mentioned, that would be impeding adaptation in the media landscape. So that is part of the discussion on media sustainability. But the other part of it really is about how can we protect media freedom? Because we're talking about attacks on journalists, of course. We're talking about harassment, threats, the use of surveillance, artificial intelligence in the digital realm, which is creating a whole bunch of new challenges for us. I think a lot of statistics, nearly 1,000 journalists and media workers killed in the past decade. We're talking about 9 out of 10 cases of murders of journalists that have not been resolved in any way. So these are clearly issues that we have to address a lot more frontally. So one thing that we did at the London conference is the UK and Canada established the Media Freedom Coalition. So this is now a coalition of 37 countries from all over the world that are working together to advocate for media freedom. So some of it is, we've had some declarations, we've weighed in on a number of cases like Maria Ressa in the Philippines. We've also talked about what's going on in Belarus. Other cases where maybe they're not getting as much attention. For example, a bunch of journalists in Yemen have been imprisoned and sentenced to death. We need to raise our voices on this. We need to be applying quick, concerted diplomatic pressure on this. Another thing that we've been doing is we've established Magnitsky type sanctions. So we've actually used those, for example, for those responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. We've also used them recently in Belarus, where we've seen attacks on media freedom. This is just one of the many tools we have. And the other thing we've developed is the Global Media Defense Fund, which is housed at UNESCO. It's a bit different from the other efforts we're talking about funding, sustainability of media. Here, it's about helping defend journalists from attacks in the courtrooms, kind of legal assistance we can provide in that. So our hope is really that by helping sustain media development and defend media freedom, these two things will create a better environment for media freedom. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to go back to James for one closing comment before we start opening up for some questions. How optimistic are you that we're going to be able to pull all this together eventually and do something really meaningful? I do think that we need to push for the 1% of ODA. I do think we need, a really sustained effort on this. I mean, if you look at have a look at any global campaign, look at the, any kind of effort that a company or a political party or an election, and you see the spending on media is an enormous part of what they do. So why is it so small in the international development field? Why are we still struggling to make this case? And how optimistic are you that we might be able to change this?
So I think the effects of a market failure are going to become more and more apparent, not just on COVID, but on a whole bunch of things. Someone's put a very good question in the chat about holding the response to the pandemic to account, but issues of corruption, I think we can expect corruption to soar in the next few months and years, because we've got to weaken the media system, and all the evidence suggests that the media is the most effective check on corruption. We can expect lots of other effects as our information and communication systems become more and more dysfunctional. And I'm afraid it's a very gloomy picture, I think, for a while now. But I think those issues are just going to hit home so fiercely. But I don't think development donors and others can actually avoid them for very much longer. And I think the other thing that's going to hit home is we've got to get out of this. What you were just talking about is actually, there are solutions to this, but you need to have institutions and systems that are capable of putting together the ingredients and and the actors who need to come up with it, whether that's development banks and private sector, public sector, media organizations. And that's another thing the International Fund is designed to do. It is a fund, just like the Global Fund creates to be in malaria, but by having, if you like, knowledge capital, the expertise, but also kind of political status as legitimacy, as well as a financial capital, I think it can work with countries and systems to actually put some of these ingredients. And one of the things we do in the feasibility study is to talk about these things, about what an exit strategy looks like. So this is not going to be a kind of short-term area. We're, just so people know, we're we're Luminate and MacArthur Foundation and others are setting up, have committed sufficient funding to set up an interim secretariat for the International Fund for Public Interest Media. We're currently hiring. We've asked Russell Reynolds to do the executive search for the founding executive director of this, and we hope to make an announcement of that before too long. I can't say exactly when, but we're fairly advanced on that process of finding an executive director, and we're quite excited about that whole process. But we know that we're in the middle of a pandemic. Resources are extraordinarily stretched. This is not a great time to be raising money for a major new fund. At the same time, the kind of need for such a fund are right front and center, I think, in terms of what everyone is, what is increasingly obvious. So we're relatively optimistic about, well, actually very optimistic about the prospects of this. I think it's a question of how long it takes. What we need clearly is political leadership, and we need demand. And what I'm increasingly seeing, what we're increasingly seeing, is that organizations on the ground are saying, the problem here is there isn't enough funding. And this is why Illuminate and others are supporting this, is that they exist to kind of do the seed funding to get new models off the ground, to really catalyze innovation, but actually sustaining media over the long term to get us out of this crisis. That needs more money and more long-term structured support. So I'm very optimistic about this. I think, by the way, and I don't know if we want to get to it, but I think there's another issue here, which is partly about solving the media crisis and also solving the, addressing the infodemic. And I think they're not quite the same thing, but we may want to get back to that if we've got time.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, James. Those are really good points. I'm going to turn to Heather Gilbert, my colleague at CIMA, to bring some questions that have been in the chats and other places to the table, and we will open it up for others to ask from the floor. I see that Kelly McNulty is here. She's been involved a lot from the Canadian side in the global conversations, and anybody else who wants to ask questions. So Heather, what do we have on in terms of questions?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and since we are just doing a Zoom call, I can ask the people who put the questions in to directly ask their question to the panelists.
That'd be good.
I think is the question from Wayne Sharp on investigative journalism. Wayne, would you like to ask your question to the panelists?
Hello.
Hi.
Yep.
Yeah, this is my question is about investigative journalism, because we know, even not only in the developing world, but also in countries in transition, it's been media donors who have funded the bulk of investigative journalism. Now, even in North America, you see groups like ProPublica and Texas Tribune getting donor funds, and that's perhaps letting some of the major publishers off the hook for funding investigative journalism. It's expensive, takes a lot of time, and a lot of the bottom line for a lot of publishers is that it just doesn't make economic sense for them. So my question basically is this a sustainable model going forward for the media donor to be the people underwriting this work? And it's a critical time to have this work being done with the COVID-19 crisis where it is. We'll have to look at, somewhere down the road, we'll have to look at how this went the way it went. And in many parts of the world, it went very badly. So it's an open question for the panel's thoughts on that issue.
Let's take another one before I see that Josh Laporte has a related question?
Yeah, Josh,
Josh,
do you want to read your question out, or I can
Yeah, I think it kind of is in terms of looking forward. And sorry, I can't get my video on. I have not much bandwidth here in Brussels at the moment. Hi to everybody. Yeah, what we've seen with our partners, our media partners around the world, mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa and South America, was when the pandemic hit, those of our media partners that had actually gone through pandemic coverage or outbreaks before, for example, with Ebola in West Africa, and then some dengue outbreaks that really hit some of our partners hard, even the newsrooms, one of our partners in Paraguay, they were much better prepared for what happened with COVID on all sorts of issues, ranging from safety of their own employees to resource allocations more efficiently and even fundraising. And what we were able to do was capture their best practices from that and share them with our network. And I'm wondering if donors have a role to play in finding these best practices that actually came out of COVID in time for the next one, or any kind of crisis that's hitting, because I'm also seeing that our partners have actually been able to, I don't want to use the word capitalize, but they've been able to really reach audiences in much better ways with much more trusted info, like I wrote there in the text, even by text messages, getting emergency and breaking news out and really building up their audiences and trust. I don't know where that leads in terms of long-term resiliency and viability, but I feel like there's some lessons out there, and I'm wondering what we can all do and what kind of resources might be there for that. Thank you.
Great. Shall we, I might turn to Marjorie to jump in on that, on those two last questions about investigative journalism and learning from the innovations that are taking place right now, and,
Right.
Anybody else who wants to talk about it.
Sure, good to hear both Josh and Wayne. Full disclosure, Wayne actually ran an investigative journalism project in Ukraine funded by Global Affairs Canada. So just full transparency. And, you know, I think we when it comes to like real investigative reporting, if it's going to be donor funded, it really has to be hands off in terms of editorial, and not every funder is equipped to operate that way. And building, it's looking at capacity and newsroom viability, not necessarily the specifics of what they're doing. And there are many investigative reporting organizations that will not take donor money or will not take government money. They might take private money, but these organizations are in desperate need of support. So I think when it comes specifically to investigative reporting, it needs to be established in a way that protects the reputation, the independence, and the role of investigative reporting. Josh, I mean, we found the same thing. We've been doing health work now for almost 20 years, and have done a lot of learning from our Ebola teams and our Ebola response, specifically around rumor tracking, as well as our HIV work that we're bringing here. And that one of the reasons why we set up the mentor bench, and I can, as soon as the resources I referred to earlier are available, I can share them with this group, however is relevant. You know, even if they were local journalists in remote places, they had methodologies and approaches that actually made them much more resilient in dealing with this situation than those that had never reported on a health crisis. And, you know, there's tons of panels and conferences, but every place where we can look at how we share those lessons learned, how we share that information, how we help journalists who are now, every journalist in the world is covering a health issue in a way that has never happened before. And every journalist in the world is finding ways to deal with disinformation around that health issue as they cover it, and coming head to head with that at the same time. And the more we as a community come together, share lessons, and learn from each other to support, you know, our partners in the media out there is super important.
I'm going to jump to James. We'll have to keep things short now because we have a hard stop at 3 o'clock in DC time. James, can you address the independent investigative journalism question?
Well, just very quickly on that, and just one other thing on the other. So on investigative journalism, I think this issue about on what terms money is provided to whom, and who governs and who makes those decisions is going to become massive quite quickly. I think it's not. I think I really welcome. I think it's fantastic what Internews has done. I really welcome what Google has done in terms of their funding that they're providing at the moment, Facebook and others. But these are not ways but funding should not be decided in this way. There needs to be, if it's about really deciding who's going to win and who's going to lose in the future, there needs to be a different way of doing this long term. And I think these issues are going to be, and I think it's all about making sure, I think it's about a decolonization issue. That's a big issue for BBC Media Action. About actually who is deciding these issues, about who's shaping the public sphere within these countries, and this is very much which the International Fund has also been designed in mind for. Just can I very quickly just say, just on the second question, is that because of donor conversation, donors tend to support news and media, and different donors tend to support health communication. And actually, these things do need to come together in a way that's not happened before. We're an unusual organization. We have very large health communication programs. We're providing about, our programs on COVID alone, including supported by Global Affairs Canada, reaching about 60 million people in 54 languages, but also doing lots of stuff on supporting news media as well. And that, you know, a lot of the stuff around misinformation and really getting people to act on COVID are things like, you need things like drama and comedy and other ways of getting information out, not just through news. And I do think these debates need to come together more than they have in the past, but that's perhaps a bigger issue we can't get into in too much detail.
But very good point, and really an interesting one. I wonder if Alex,
Mark,
you do want to, yes,
yeah,
Alex.
thank you. Thank you very much. You read my mind there. Excellent questions. I'll try and be very brief. And when it comes to investigative reporting, and then also to the second question about how the support of that can happen, there, in that sort of information ecosystem, there would be core initiatives where the funding could probably go directly to the media house and an investigative team, and that's the actual reporting. And then there'd be what we'd call supporting initiatives, and this is how the journalism is done. So the investigative reporting team needs access to reliable data. They need to be able to process that data. They need to be able to investigate the data and then make sense of it and all that. And for some funders, while funding there would be a lot to navigate to be able to get to funding the investigative journalism in a way that both the practitioner, that's a journalist, and the audience are comfortable that this is free and fair and independent. The supporting initiatives space where, for example, I'll give you an example more specific, and this is not investigative reporting, but it could be stretched. Within the COVID context, one of the funding initiatives that we're doing at the Gates Foundation is looking at data journalism and funding a data hub that will get source as close to real time as possible for someone like, say, the Africa CDC or the World Health Organization. They produce pre-produced to an extent data visualizations, data sets that have been broken down, and they take the heavy lift out of accessing reliable data, making it readily available, and then making it available as a public good to media practitioners open. So that way you reduce this likelihood of picking one media house that you support and therefore picking winners, which James mentioned, but you also make it easier for the practitioner of investigative journalism to do that by reducing the cost of finding readily accessible data that they can investigate, that is already pre-prepared, cleaned, it has been harvested, processed, and made available for them to be able to stretch and play with. And then the other thing would also be in that space of supporting initiatives is sometimes media entities need to know what is working so that you can stop spending money on what is not working. So media evaluation, lessons learned, and tracking can be fairly expensive. And this is where, again, funders can come in to create public goods. So for example, we supported the Center for Investigative Reporting and gave them a grant, and they built this offline impact tracker, which was designed by Lindsay Green-Barber, who some of you might know. And this tool is available to all reporters and all media houses. So it really helps investigative reporters to be able to track their work over years be able to fill it out in different sections, from reporters to beats and see what's working, what's not working, how is it working. And that way, media houses are able to manage and direct their resources more in a more cost-effective manner. So some of these supporting initiatives that are public goods could be another way of fueling investigative reporting and addressing some of the other concerns and mitigating against some of the other risks. Mark.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for bringing that up. We have a question for Simon from Mel Bunce, asking if you think it will be possible as GDP as the GDP drops and as the issues around COVID continue to take center stage, for governments to really make the case for official aid to media development? Or do you think it's getting more unpromising going forward? If you could just answer really quickly so that we can end on time, but I think it's a good question.
It's certainly a very good question. I mean, I don't want to speculate too much about where things are going to go, but I think it's likely there's going to be some adjustment once the immediate crisis subsides and budgets need to get back on track. I think that's going to happen across the board. Now, how it'll affect different sectors, again, that remains to be seen. I'll just say two things here. One, the COVID pandemic has really highlighted the importance of media more than anything else. And we've also gone through a number of years where we've seen the effects of disinformation in our political systems. So I think we're very acutely aware in Canada about how important this is, not to mention the domestic challenges we face in our own media space, right? So we understand that this is important. The question is, how much can we allocate overseas? And here we'll have to be innovative. We'll have to look at examples of pooled funding. I think some of the examples that have been brought up are very interesting. They help us be more efficient, get to the recipients more quickly, perhaps be more effective. So I think these are the kinds of things we're gonna have to look at to make sure we get the right effect.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I want to thank everyone for spending this time with us. I think it's been a really terrific conversation. We've had great interventions, and I hope we can all learn from what's been said here and take it to the next level. Please engage with us and work with us at CIMA and all the different organizations that are represented here. We're all very open and ready to work with you, and we hope we can continue this conversation here and as we go forward at the event in November. And I'm really, really glad that we've opened this link with Canada. It's just a really terrific partnership that I hope we can deepen and make more meaningful as time goes on. So thank you all for coming, and have a great weekend, and we'll see you again.